I gotta finish this tonight. I've changed the other side and I've changed the angle. I think I look like it is the way it is. I'm not gonna be focused on my jawline anymore, am I? Alright, let's see what we got here. What's going on with the other side of the brain? To peer beneath the deceptive surfaces of affluent America, Harrington suggested it was necessary to enrich individual observation with social measurement. He made extensive use of statistics in the other America, but he found ways to present them that prevented the non-public policy specialists' eyes from glazing over. Quote, sometimes in the course of an official government report, end quote, he wrote, quote, a human being will suddenly emerge from the shadow of statistics and analyses, end quote. Or in another passage, quote, sometimes the statistics of poverty can be read like a detective story, end quote. The technique made author and reader allies in the struggle to come to grips with a vast but understandable and thus solvable social ill. Harrington did not imagine the poor as finer, more authentic, or more generous human beings than their better-off brethren, as beat novelist Jack Kerouac had recently done in On the Road, or as Jean Steinbeck had done a generation earlier in The Grapes of Wrath. The lives of the poor, as portrayed in the other America, were generally nasty, brutish, and short, precisely because they lacked such amenities of middle-class life as decent housing, education, nutrition, and medical care. Harrington did not hesitate to present the seedier side of the other America, including domestic violence, sexual promiscuity, and substance abuse. In his view, this was all part and product of the culture of poverty, a judgment not on the poor as individuals, but on a society until now indifferent to their plight. The Other America was a book about poor people, but it was not a book written for poor people. The readers Harrington was speaking to were themselves citizens of the affluent society whose consciences he sought to stir, and among those readers, reputedly, was President John F. Kennedy, although whether he actually read the book or the lengthy and favorable review by literary critic Dwight MacDonald that appeared in the pages of the New Yorker in February 1963 remains in dispute. Either way, according to James Sundquist, a political scientist who was involved in early discussions of anti-poverty legislation, the Other America brought to an end piecemeal thinking about social problems in the Kennedy administration. As Sundquist noted in a 1969 essay on the origins of the war on poverty, the Kennedy administration had been considering proposals, quote, dealing separately with such problems as slum housing, juvenile delinquency, unemployment, dependency, and illiteracy. But they were separately inadequate because they were striking only at some of the surface aspects of a bedrock problem, and that bedrock problem had to be identified and defined so that it could be attacked in a concerted, unified, and innovative way. Perhaps it was Harrington's book that identified the target for Kennedy and supplied the coordinating concept. The bedrock problem, in a word, was poverty. Words and concepts define programs. Once the target was reduced to a single word, the timing became right for a unified program, end quote. Following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, took up the issue, and in his State of the Union address in January 1964, pledged his administration to waging an unconditional war on poverty. Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy-in-law and director of the Peace Corps, headed up the task force charged by the new president with drawing up anti-poverty legislation, and he invited the author of The Other America to Washington as a consultant in February 1964. Harrington's success, symbolized by that invitation to lend his expertise to the federal anti-poverty effort, would have ironic consequences. Other America popularized the phrase culture of poverty, which went on to shape the main thrust of Johnson's war on poverty. But a close reading of Harrington's book reveals an ambiguity in his employment of that term. Throughout the book, he used culture of poverty interchangeably with another term, vicious circle, a staple of reformist literature since the Progressive era. Quote, here is one of the most familiar forms of the vicious circle of poverty, end quote, Harrington wrote in a typical passage. Quote, the poor get sick more than anyone else in this society. That is because they live in slums jammed together under unhygienic conditions, they have inadequate diets, and cannot get decent medical care. When they become sick, they are sick longer than any other group in society. Because they are sick more often and longer than anyone else, they lose wages and work and find it difficult to hold a steady job. and because of this, they cannot pay for good housing, for a nutritious diet, for doctors. At any given point in this circle, particularly when there is a major illness, your prospect is to move to an even lower level and to begin the cycle round and round toward even more suffering. End quote. Harrington sought to convince his readers that poverty was a condition not easy to shed. Everything in their lives, the other Americans conspired to keep them in poverty. Outside intervention by the federal government was necessary to improve their condition, but nothing in the vicious circle he sketched above was culturally determined in the sense that anthropologist Oscar Lewis had meant when he talked of the culture of poverty as a normative system at odds with the values of the larger society, an ingrained and unchanging way of life passed down from generation to generation. No part of the circle Harrington described was related to a low level of aspiration, or a tendency to indulge in immediate gratification, or a propensity for violence or sexual promiscuity. Poor nutrition, poor medical care, poor housing, and the resultant frequent and lengthy illnesses were a result of lack of income, not of cultural traits or behaviors. Everything that Harrington described in this particular example of the vicious circle could be improved through the simple expedient of additional household income. Harrington's prescription for combating poverty was a broad federal jobs program, putting the unemployed to work, in essence, a return to the New Deal's strategy for coping with the Great Depression. But the war that the federal government fought against poverty in the 1960s was not fought according to that strategy. Harrington had indeed succeeded in focusing Washington's attention on the invisible land of the poor, but as Sundquist noted, words and concepts define programs. And the concept that caught the attention of policymakers, thanks to the other America, was the culture of poverty. And if the problem was one of culture rather than simply lack of income, policymakers reasoned federally financed jobs were not the appropriate solution. The policies eventually adopted by Shriver for the war on poverty were intended to help the poor to improve themselves so that they could take advantage of an expanding economy. A hand up, not a handout, as he put it at the time. That meant an emphasis on measures such as preschool enrichment and job training programs, along with the establishment of community action agencies in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Compared with job programs, these were relatively inexpensive initiatives, which was part of their political appeal. President Johnson made it clear to Shriver that appropriations for his unconditional war had to be fought on the cheap. 30 years earlier, at the height of the New Deal, Congress had appropriated $5 billion for public works programs. In the first year of the war on poverty, the appropriations for Sergeant Shriver's programs were held to under $1 billion, which, given the rate of inflation in the meantime, was more like a tenth than a fifth of the original sum. Underfinanced and not always well targeted, the war on poverty was still not the utter and abject failure of later conservative legend. Community action agencies proved a controversial and short-lived experiment, soon abandoned. But other programs, such as the preschool program Head Start, were more successful. The poverty rate declined shortly during the course of the decade, from 22.4% in 1960 to 12.1% in 1969. The decline in poverty among the elderly was particularly striking, thanks to the creation of Medicare and increased Social Security benefits, not strictly speaking part of the war on poverty, but sharing the same sponsors and goals. Over the years since, older Americans have remained underrepresented in the ranks of the poor as a result of those federal programs, with only 9% falling below the poverty line in 2010. So, if President Johnson's social welfare programs established a record of at least modest successes, why have they fared so poorly in popular memory of the 1960s? Quote, "We fought a war against poverty," end quote, President Ronald Reagan once famously quipped. Quote, "and poverty won," end quote. If so, it's hard to understand why the poverty level has never returned to the levels of the late 1950s, neither in the economically troubled 1970s nor during the Great Recession that began in 2008. In politics, however, perception not infrequently trumps reality. Americans like their wars, actual and metaphorical, to deliver swift and unconditional victories, and that kind of victory was beyond the capacity of the war on poverty to deliver.